The smell of Harold's office hadn't changed in 40 years. Old leather, cedar wood polish. The faint ghost of the pipe tobacco he'd given up in '98 but never stopped missing. I used to love that smell. Now it sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving, pressing against ribs that had forgotten how to expand properly since they put him in the ground 3 weeks ago. I sat in the corner chair, the green wingback he'd bought me for our 30th anniversary, so I could keep him company while he worked. I hadn't moved from it in an hour, hadn't spoken, hadn't needed to. Vanessa was doing enough moving for both of us. She worked through his desk like a woman possessed, her French manicured nails clicking against drawer handles, her breath coming in short, impatient huffs. She didn't look at me. She hadn't really looked at me in years, not since she'd decided I was furniture, something to be arranged around, tolerated until it could be removed. "Where did he keep the safe combination?" she asked, not turning around. "Derek said he wrote it down somewhere." "I don't know." It wasn't a lie. Harold had kept many things from me in those final months. I'd thought it was the illness, the fog of medication, the weight of knowing the end was close. Now, watching my daughter-in-law rifle through his papers like a raccoon in garbage, I wondered if he'd been hiding something else entirely. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust motes Vanessa's searching had stirred into the air. They floated like tiny ghosts. I watched them instead of her. She yanked open the bottom drawer, the deep one where Harold kept old correspondence, letters from suppliers, birthday cards from the grandchildren. Her hand emerged with a fistful of cream-colored papers, and she shuffled through them with the efficiency of a blackjack dealer. "Worthless," she muttered, tossing one toward the trash bin. It missed, landing on the carpet like a wounded bird. "This is just old trash, Martha. It should stay buried forever, just like your husband's secrets." My heart clenched. Secrets. "There's nothing of value here for you," she continued, standing, brushing invisible dust from her silk blouse. She finally looked at me, and her eyes held the particular contempt she reserved for things that had outlived their usefulness. "I'll tell Derek we need to call the estate service. Someone who knows what they're doing." She left without saying goodbye. The click of her heels faded down the hallway, then the front door opened and closed, and then there was silence. The house had never felt so empty. I didn't move for a long moment. The cream-colored paper lay on the carpet, slightly crumpled from its journey toward the trash. From where I sat, I could see Harold's handwriting, that familiar slant, the way his H's always looked like they were leaning into a strong wind. 40 years of grocery lists and love notes and birthday cards had burned that handwriting into my memory. My knees protested as I stood. 63 years old, and my body had started keeping score of every insult, every hour spent on concrete floors at the hardware store, every box lifted, every worry carried. I crossed the room slowly, my stockinged feet silent on the old Persian rug. I bent down. My fingers trembled as I picked up the paper. The words swam for a moment, grief and age conspiring to blur my vision. But then they sharpened, and I read what my husband had left behind. "My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leaving, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to tell you. 2 months ago, I found something that broke my heart worse than this failing body ever could. Vanessa has been stealing from us, from our company, from our family. Over $2 million, Martha. Wire transfers with my forged signature. A shell company run by that friend of hers, Tina Marsh, and Eugene helped her, my own brother. He gave her everything she needed to destroy us. I couldn't confront them. The doctor said no stress, no excitement, nothing that would strain what's left of my heart. But you're stronger than me. You always were. Take this to Theodore at the bank. The receipt at the bottom is for a safety deposit box. There are bearer bonds inside. $500,000 they don't know about. Use it to fight them. Don't trust Derek until he proves himself. I love our son, but he's lost in her shadow. Win this war for us, Martha. I believe in you. Forever yours, Harold. My hands were shaking so badly, the paper rattled like a leaf in a storm. $2 million. Forged signatures. Eugene. Eugene, who had bounced Derek on his knee at family barbecues, who had cried at Harold's funeral with such convincing grief. The betrayal was so vast, I couldn't hold it all at once. It came in waves, each name another blow, each detail another knife. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, something old and hard and patient. 40 years ago, I had stood in an empty storefront with sawdust on my shoes and told Harold we could build something from nothing. And we had. Every nail, every invoice, every handshake, we had built Miller Hardware and Supply with our bare hands and stubborn hearts. Vanessa thought I was a fragile widow lost in grief. She was about to learn otherwise. I folded the paper carefully, tucked it into my purse, and went to find my car keys. First Regional Bank of Cedarbrook sat on the corner of Main and Holbrook, the same corner it had occupied since 1952. Theodore Crane met me at the door. He'd been expecting me for a different reason, something about signature cards for the estate account. His smile was warm as he ushered me into his office, that familiar mix of professional courtesy and genuine friendship that came from 30 years of shared history. "Martha," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Can I get you some coffee? Water?" "No, Theodore. I need you to read something." I handed him the letter, watched his face as his eyes moved across Harold's words. The color drained from his cheeks like water from a sink. His jaw tightened. He read it again, slower this time, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held something I hadn't expected. Fear. "Martha," he said quietly, "where did you find this?" "In his office." Vanessa threw it away. She didn't read it. Theodore stood abruptly, moved to his door, and locked it. The click was loud in the sudden silence. He returned to his desk but didn't sit. Instead, he picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Janet, cancel my next 3 appointments and get me the file on the Miller Hardware accounts, every transaction from the past 3 years. He paused. "Yes, all of them." He hung up and finally looked at me again. His hand was trembling slightly as he set down the phone. "Mrs. Miller," he said, and the formality of it sent ice down my spine. "I need you to call the police immediately." "Theodore, what?" "And please." He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not leave this room." The dust motes floated in the afternoon light slanting through his window. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and went unanswered, and I sat in that leather chair, my husband's final words clutched in my purse, and understood that the war Harold had warned me about had just begun. The fluorescent lights in Theodore's back office hummed like a swarm of dying insects. He'd moved me here after the phone call, away from the windows, away from the main floor where tellers counted money and customers made small talk about the weather. This room smelled of old paper and toner ink, and the coffee he'd poured me 20 minutes ago had gone cold in my hands. I hadn't taken a single sip. 3 years, Theodore said, spreading documents across the table like a surgeon laying out instruments. "That's how long it's been going on, maybe longer. We're still pulling records." I stared at the papers. Wire transfer authorizations, every one of them bearing Harold's signature in that familiar, wind-leaning script. Except it wasn't his signature. I knew that now. The H was too upright, the loop on the M too tight. Small differences, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 40 years watching that hand write love notes and grocery lists and birthday cards. 14 transfers, Theodore continued, all routed to the same destination, Marsh Consulting LLC, a company registered in Delaware with no employees, no physical address, and no legitimate business purpose. Tina Marsh. The name tasted like ash on my tongue. Vanessa's friend. Yes. Theodore pulled out another sheet. The money sat in that account for 30 days, then moved again, offshore. Cayman Islands. We're working with federal investigators to trace it further, but these things take time. $2,100,000. 40 years of early mornings and late nights. 40 years of calloused hands and aching backs, and the particular exhaustion that comes from building something real. Gone. Siphoned away by a woman who thought my husband's life's work was nothing more than a cash register waiting to be emptied. My phone buzzed in my purse. I glanced at the screen. Derek's name glowed against the glass. I let it ring. The memory came unbidden, the way they do when your heart is breaking and your mind needs somewhere safe to hide. Spring 1984. The storefront on Birch Street, empty except for sawdust and possibility. Harold stood in the center of that dusty room, with his sleeves rolled up and his hair still dark, and his smile, God, that smile, bright enough to light the whole town. "We're going to build something here, Martha," he'd said. "Something that lasts. Something we can leave behind." I'd laughed at him. 23 years old, 8 months pregnant with Derek, standing in a room that smelled of mildew and broken dreams. With what money? With these. He held up his hands, broad palms, thick fingers, the hands of a man who'd never been afraid of work. And these. He crossed the room and took my hands in his, pressed them flat against his chest, where his heart beat steady and strong. "We've got everything we need." And we did. For 40 years, we did. The memory shifted, darkened. Another spring, 12 years ago. The rehearsal dinner for Derek's wedding. Harold had pulled me aside near the kitchen, his face troubled in a way I rarely saw. "There's something behind her eyes, Martha," he'd whispered, nodding toward Vanessa as she laughed with the caterers, all charm and white teeth and perfect posture. "Something hungry." "She loves him," I'd said. "That's enough." "Is it?" I'd dismissed him. Told him he was being protective, old-fashioned, paranoid. Told him our son was a grown man who could make his own choices. Now I sat in a bank's back office, 40 years of trust turned to ash, and I understood that Harold had seen the wolf when I'd only seen the smile. My phone buzzed again. Derek. Again, I let it ring. The guilt was a physical thing, a weight on my chest, a thickness in my throat. I should have listened, should have watched more carefully, should have... But the past was a locked room, and I didn't have the key. The only door open was the one leading forward. Theodore returned with a fresh cup of coffee and a grim expression. "There's more," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "And I'm sorry, Martha. I'm so sorry. Tell me." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Bank access logs, dates and times printed in neat columns. 6 months ago, someone accessed the Miller hardware account records using credentials that should have been deactivated years ago. Old credentials, from when the account was first opened. I scanned the page, not understanding. Whose credentials? Theodore's voice was barely above a whisper. Eugene Miller's. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling the solid wood beneath my fingers, using it to anchor myself to a world that suddenly made no sense. Eugene, Harold's older brother. The man who'd held my hand at the funeral, who'd wept at the graveside, who'd told me if there was anything I needed, anything at all. He gave her the signature samples, Theodore continued, each word another nail in a coffin I hadn't known was being built. Account numbers, security questions. Everything she needed to access the accounts without raising flags. Why? The word came out broken, a sound more than a question. Harold cut him out of the business 40 years ago. There was a dispute, something about inventory, missing cash. Harold never pressed charges, but he never forgave either. Theodore shook his head slowly. 40 years is a long time to carry a grudge, Martha. Long enough for it to turn into something ugly. My husband's brother, my son's uncle, the man who'd taught Derek to fish, who'd carved the wooden train that still sat on my mantelpiece, who'd been family in every way that mattered. The betrayal was so complete it was almost beautiful, a perfect circle of treachery. Daughter-in-law, brother, friend, all of them smiling, all of them waiting, all of them feeding on the trust we'd given so freely. "The police are on their way," Theodore said gently. "Federal investigators, too. But Martha, I need you to understand something. I looked up at him, waited. If we move too fast, they'll run. Vanessa, her father, the Marsh woman, they'll disappear and the money with them. We need time to build the case, freeze the accounts, coordinate with law enforcement in other jurisdictions. What are you asking me to do? Go home, act normal, say nothing. His eyes held mine, steady and serious. Can you do that? Can you look at the woman who stole your life's work and pretend you don't know? I thought of the green wingback chair, the dust motes floating in Harold's office, the way Vanessa had looked at me, like furniture, like something to be arranged around and eventually discarded. Yes, I said. I can. I gathered my purse, tucked Harold's letter deep inside where no one would think to look. Theodore walked me to the side exit, away from the main lobby, away from prying eyes. I'll call you tonight, he said. Use a landline if you can, and Martha, I know. I managed something that was almost a smile. Trust no one. I pushed through the door into the afternoon sunlight, car keys already in my hand, and stopped. Across the parking lot, a silver Mercedes had just pulled into a space near the main entrance. The door opened, and Vanessa stepped out, phone pressed to her ear, designer sunglasses catching the light, her mouth moving in what looked like agitation. She hadn't seen me. Not yet. I forced my legs to move, forced my hands to stay steady as I unlocked my car. I could feel her presence like a heat on my skin, like the gaze of a predator scanning the clearing for movement. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine. Pulled out of the lot, slowly, carefully, just a grieving widow running errands on a Tuesday afternoon. In my rearview mirror, I watched Vanessa stride toward the bank's front door, her heels clicking against the pavement like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. The war had begun, and she didn't even know it yet. The house I'd lived in for 37 years had become foreign territory. I felt it the moment I stepped through the front door. That subtle shift in the air, the way familiar rooms can turn hostile when you finally see them clearly. The grandfather clock in the hallway still ticked its steady rhythm. The smell of lemon polish still clung to the banister. But everything was different now, colored by the knowledge I carried like a stone in my chest. They were waiting in the living room. Vanessa sat on the edge of Harold's leather armchair, his chair, the one no one else ever used, with a manila folder open on her lap. Derek stood by the window, his back to me, shoulders hunched in that way he'd had since childhood, whenever he knew he was doing something wrong. And in the center of the sofa, legs crossed, smile wide as a snake's, sat a man I'd met only a handful of times. Richard Gaines, Vanessa's father. Martha, he rose with the practiced grace of a man who'd spent his life making entrances. I'm so sorry we haven't had more time together. This must be such a difficult period. His cologne reached me before his handshake did. Something expensive and overwhelming, the kind of scent designed to fill a room and dominate it. His palm was dry and smooth, the hand of someone who'd never lifted anything heavier than a fountain pen or a marked deck of cards. I looked into his eyes and saw exactly what Harold had warned me about. That hunger, that calculation behind the warmth. "Richard," I said, "what a surprise." "Daddy flew in to help with the estate," Vanessa said, not looking up from her folder. "There's so much paperwork, and we didn't want you to feel overwhelmed." Daddy. 41 years old, and she still called him Daddy. It might have been endearing if I didn't know what they were. That's very thoughtful. I lowered myself into the wingback chair across from them, feeling the familiar embrace of cushions that had held me through 40 years of evenings. But I'm quite tired today. Perhaps tomorrow. It won't take long. Vanessa finally met my eyes, and I saw the impatience flickering there like a pilot light waiting for gas. Just a few signatures, routine things. She held out a pen. Derek still hadn't turned from the window. His reflection in the glass was a ghost, transparent and insubstantial. My son. My boy. The child I'd nursed through fevers and heartbreaks and the ordinary cruelties of growing up. When had I lost him? I'm sorry, I said, making my voice quaver just slightly. My head isn't clear today. The grief, you understand. I'd hate to sign something I haven't read properly. Richard's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. Of course, Martha. Of course. Family comes first. We can wait. We can... But Vanessa's foot had begun to tap against the hardwood floor. A rapid, staccato rhythm that betrayed everything her face tried to hide. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the darkness of the bedroom I'd shared with Harold for nearly 4 decades, staring at the ceiling where shadows gathered like conspirators. The pillow beside me still held the faint impression of his head. I hadn't been able to wash the sheets, couldn't bear to erase that last physical proof that he'd been real, been here, been mine. The house creaked and settled around me, speaking in the language old houses use, the groan of cooling wood, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, and beneath it, another sound. Voices. I rose slowly, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The hallway stretched before me, lit only by the thin glow of a nightlight near the bathroom. Derek and Vanessa's room was at the far end, the door slightly ajar. I crept closer. Years of midnight trips to check on a sick child had taught me where every creaky board lay hidden. Didn't add up? Vanessa's voice, sharp and low. The manager was acting strange, nervous. You're imagining things. Derek, placating, weak. I don't imagine things. Something's wrong. She was there today, I know she was. Janet at the front desk let it slip. A pause. The rustle of bedsheets. The old woman needs to sign before we can move forward. Richard's voice now. He must have been in the room with them. The house, the remaining accounts, the business shares. Once her name is on those documents, she's stalling. Vanessa cut him off. Playing the grieving widow card, but she's not as stupid as she looks. She's 63 and alone. Richard's tone was soothing, the voice of a man who'd talked Marks out of their life savings a dozen times before. Grief makes people pliable. We just need to... The floor creaked beneath my foot. Silence, instant and total, like a held breath. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering so loudly I was certain they could hear it through the plaster. Seconds stretched into eternities. Sweat prickled along my spine. Then Vanessa laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. Probably just the house settling. This place is ancient. We'll tear it down once it's ours. I retreated to my room on legs that trembled with more than age. Closed the door, leaned against it until my breathing slowed. Tear it down. The house Harold built with his own hands. The house where we'd raised our son, celebrated anniversaries, weathered storms, both literal and figurative. The rage that had been simmering beneath my grief finally caught fire. Morning light filled the kitchen with false cheerfulness. I made breakfast the way I'd made it for 40 years. Eggs scrambled soft, toast cut diagonal, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The routine was armor now, a disguise I wore over the fury burning in my chest. Derek stumbled in first, avoiding my eyes as he reached for the coffee pot. Then Vanessa, already dressed in silken heels, tapping at her phone without a word of greeting. Richard appeared last, his smile firmly in place despite the early hour. I served them like a waitress, like staff, like furniture. The doorbell rang at 8:30. Eugene stood on the porch with a casserole dish in his hands and sympathy arranged carefully on his weathered face. Martha, I hope I'm not intruding. Just wanted to check on my favorite sister-in-law. Favorite. The word curdled in my stomach. Eugene, how thoughtful. I stepped aside to let him in, watching the way his eyes darted toward the office, toward the places where Harold's secrets had been kept. Coffee? Please. I poured him a cup in the kitchen while Vanessa and Richard made small talk in the living room. Derek had vanished upstairs, hiding as usual. I was thinking, Eugene said, accepting the mug with hands that had once helped forge my husband's signature on documents that stole our future. That I could help you sort through Harold's papers. So much of it is old business records. You shouldn't have to deal with that alone. I looked into his eyes, Harold's eyes, the same shade of gray, the same shape, and I smiled. That would be lovely, Eugene. You always were the organized one in the family. His relief was visible. He thought he'd won, thought the foolish old widow was inviting the wolf into the henhouse. After he left, I waited until Vanessa took Richard to see the property lines, scouting, no doubt, for what they planned to sell. Then I lifted the kitchen phone from its cradle and dialed Theodore's number. "It's me," I said quietly. "They're circling. Eugene came by this morning, offering to help with Harold's papers." "Let him." Theodore's voice was steady. "We're almost ready. But Martha, there's something else." "Tell me." "Richard Gaines. We ran a deeper background check. He has an outstanding warrant in Arizona. Fraud, wire transfer schemes, the whole pattern. This isn't his first time." I closed my eyes. Of course it wasn't. "How soon can you move?" 48 hours, maybe less. Can you hold on that long?" Through the kitchen window, I watched Vanessa and Richard walking the perimeter of my property, pointing, planning, dividing up a life they hadn't earned. "I've held on for 40 years, Theodore." I gripped the phone tighter. "I can manage 2 more days." The Bluebird Diner sat 12 miles outside Cedarbrook on a stretch of county road that hadn't seen fresh asphalt since the Reagan administration. I'd chosen it for exactly that reason. No one from town came here. No one who mattered would see Martha Miller sliding into a cracked vinyl booth across from a man in a banker's suit and a woman with a federal badge. "Mrs. Miller." Agent Patricia Moreno didn't smile as she shook my hand. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that had seen too much to waste time on pleasantries. "Theodore's told me a great deal about you." "I hope some of it was flattering." "He said you were tougher than you looked." Her gaze held mine. "I'm counting on that being true." The waitress brought coffee, burnt, bitter, served in cups that had seen better decades. I wrapped my hands around the warmth and waited. Theodore spread a folder on the table between us. "We've completed the trace. The money moved from Miller Hardware's accounts to Marsh Consulting LLC, then to a series of shell companies in Delaware and Nevada, and finally to 2 accounts in the Cayman Islands. Those accounts are now frozen," Agent Moreno added. "As of 6 o'clock this morning." I thought of Vanessa's agitation at breakfast, the way she'd paced the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, voice climbing toward panic. Now I understood. "Richard Gaines is the key," Moreno continued. "His warrant in Arizona gives us federal jurisdiction. Wire fraud across state lines, conspiracy, money laundering. We're looking at 15 to 20 years for the primary actors. Our primary actors." I repeated the phrase slowly. "That includes my daughter-in-law." "Yes, ma'am. And her father, and the woman running the shell company, Tina Marsh." Moreno paused. "We also have evidence against Eugene Miller, accessory charges at minimum. My husband's brother, 70 years old, and he'd spent his final years in a cell." I felt nothing. The grief had burned away, leaving only the cold clarity of purpose. "What do you need from me?" Theodore and Moreno exchanged a glance. Then Theodore leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "We need them all in one place, somewhere controlled, somewhere we can execute the arrests cleanly, without flight risk." "The bank," I said. It wasn't a question. "You'll invite them to finalize the estate documents. Tell them you're ready to sign. Tell them you want everything notarized, official, above board." Theodore's eyes held something like admiration. "They won't be able to resist." I looked down at the coffee cooling in my hands. 40 years of building, 3 years of theft, 3 weeks of grief, and now it came down to a phone call. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Moreno slid a card across the table. "Call me when it's confirmed." I tucked the card into my purse next to Harold's letter. 2 weapons now, paper and purpose, waiting to be deployed. Vanessa was waiting when I returned. She stood in the foyer like a guard dog, arms crossed, silk blouse slightly rumpled, a state of disarray I'd never seen her permit. Behind her, Richard sat on the stairs, pretending to read something on his phone. His eyes tracked me the moment I stepped through the door. "Where have you been?" Vanessa's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Errands." I set my purse on the entry table, careful to keep my movements slow, unthreatening. The pharmacy, the dry cleaner, the small tasks that pile up. "We need to talk about the documents." "Yes." I began unbuttoning my coat. "I've been thinking about that." Vanessa's posture shifted, not relaxed, but recalibrated, the predator scenting opportunity. "The accounts aren't—" She stopped herself, visibly swallowing whatever she'd been about to reveal. "There are some time-sensitive matters. We really should finalize everything today." "Today?" I let confusion creep into my voice. "But I don't have all the papers here, and I'd feel so much more comfortable doing this properly." "What do you mean, properly?" I turned to face her fully, arranging my features into the mask of a frightened widow seeking safety and procedure. "At the bank, with Theodore. He's offered to notarize everything personally, make sure it's all official. You know how Harold always insisted on doing things by the book." I watched the calculation flicker across her face. Suspicion warring with greed. The bank was public, institutional, legitimate. The perfect cover for transferring assets that weren't hers to take. Richard rose from the stairs, sliding his phone into his pocket. "That's actually not a bad idea, sweetheart." His voice was smooth as oil on water. "Banks make everything look proper, if there are ever any questions later." "Fine." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Tomorrow morning." "Afternoon would be better," I said. 2 o'clock. Theodore mentioned he had meetings until then. The lie came so easily. 40 years of honesty. And in the end, I discovered I had a talent for deception when the cause was just. 2 o'clock. Vanessa turned and walked toward the kitchen, Richard trailing behind her. I allowed myself one breath of relief. Then I noticed the shadow in the hallway near the stairs. Derek, watching. His face was unreadable in the dim light, but something in his posture had changed. The perpetual slump of his shoulders seemed less pronounced. His eyes, when they met mine, held a question I couldn't answer. Not yet. That night, I sat in Harold's office for the last time. The leather chair held me like an old friend. The smell of cedar and pipe tobacco wrapped around me like a ghost's embrace. Moonlight slanted through the window, painting silver stripes across the desk where my husband had worked and worried and planned for our future. I held the cream-colored letter in my hands. "I'm scared, Harold." The words came out barely above a whisper, offered to the empty room and the memory of the man who'd filled it. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." The silence answered. But in that silence, I heard his voice as clearly as if he'd been sitting across from me. "You're stronger than me. You always were." I read his words again, the confession, the love, the faith he'd placed in me when he knew he wouldn't be there to fight beside me. "I won't let them win," I told him. "I promise." Then I picked up the phone and began to dial. Vanessa, first. 2 o'clock tomorrow. Theodore will have everything ready. We'll be there. Flat. Impatient. Already counting money she'd never touch. Richard's cell next. "Mr. Gaines, I just wanted to confirm you'll be joining us. I know how much Vanessa values your guidance." "Wouldn't miss it, Martha." Charm dripping from every syllable. And finally, a number Theodore had given me. A woman's voice, young and wary. "Tina, this is Martha Miller, Vanessa's mother-in-law. I understand you've been helping manage some of the family accounts?" A pause. "Yes. Theodore says we'll need all parties present to finalize the trust documents. Something about fiduciary signatures. Could you come to First Regional Bank tomorrow at 2? Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her texting Vanessa, confirming this was legitimate. "I'll be there, Mrs. Miller." "Wonderful. See you then." I hung up. The trap was set, the web complete. "Mom?" I turned. Derek stood in the doorway, his face pale in the moonlight, his hands hanging loose at his sides like a little boy who'd wandered into something he didn't understand. "What are you doing?" I looked at my son, my boy, the child I'd nursed and raised and loved despite everything. The man who'd let himself be led astray by a woman who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. What I should have done years ago. He opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes glistened in the darkness. "Mom, tomorrow," I said quietly. "You'll understand everything tomorrow." I rose from the chair and walked past him, my hand brushing his shoulder as I went. Behind me, I heard him sink into his father's chair, and though I didn't turn around, I could have sworn I heard him weeping. I dressed for battle. The navy dress Harold had loved. "You look like the sea before a storm," he'd told me once, his hands straightening my collar, his eyes soft with decades of devotion. The pearls he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, each one chosen individually from a jeweler in Columbus who'd thought he was crazy for spending 3 hours on a single strand. The low heels that let me stand firm without wobbling. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't a grieving widow. She wasn't a fragile old woman lost in confusion and sorrow. She was something older, harder, a creature forged in 40 years of early mornings and late nights, of sacrifice and struggle, of building something real with her bare hands and watching vultures circle it the moment her husband's heart stopped beating. I touched the pearls at my throat. "Today, Harold," I whispered, "today we finish this." The drive to town stretched longer than usual, or perhaps time had simply decided to thicken, to give weight to these final moments before everything changed. Derek sat behind the wheel of my sedan, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He hadn't spoken since breakfast, hadn't looked at Vanessa when she'd kissed his cheek and announced she'd drive separately with her father. Something had shifted in him overnight. I'd heard him moving through the house at 3 a.m., heard the creak of Harold's office door, heard silence that stretched long enough to hold a reckoning. "Mom." His voice cracked on the single syllable. "Not yet," I said gently. "Wait until it's done." He nodded. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. In the side mirror, I watched Richard's silver Mercedes following at a careful distance. Behind that, a white compact, Tina Marsh, summoned like all the others, walking willingly into the web I'd woven. The turn signal ticked its steady rhythm as Derek pulled into the bank's parking lot. Tick, tick, tick. Like a countdown. Like a heartbeat slowing toward its final rest. First Regional Bank of Cedarbrook had never felt so small. Theodore met us in the lobby, his professional smile firmly in place, his eyes betraying nothing of what waited behind the polished wood doors of the main conference room. He shook hands with everyone. Richard's grip too firm, Vanessa's too brief, Tina's damp with nervous sweat. "Right this way," he said. "I've prepared everything in the executive conference room. More space for all the paperwork." The room was larger than his office. A long mahogany table, leather chairs, windows that looked out onto Main Street, where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the glass. Documents lay spread across the table's surface, arranged in neat stacks with colored tabs marking signature lines. But they weren't the documents Vanessa expected. "What is this?" She picked up the top sheet, scanning it with narrowing eyes. "These aren't the estate transfers. These are account statements?" "There's been a slight change in the agenda." Theodore's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Please, everyone take a seat. We have much to discuss." Richard's smile flickered. "I should make a phone call first. Excuse me?" He moved toward the door, reached for the handle. It didn't turn. The doors lock automatically during private consultations. Theodore said. Security protocol. I'm sure you understand. Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of something feral beneath the charm, before he reassembled his features into polite confusion. Of course, of course. Tina Marsh had gone pale. She clutched her designer handbag like a life preserver, her eyes darting between Vanessa and the locked door and the documents that shouldn't exist. Theodore, what's going on? Vanessa's voice held an edge of warning. Martha, tell him to open the door. I said nothing, simply watched. The side door opened. Agent Patricia Moreno stepped through first, her badge catching the fluorescent light. Behind her came two uniformed officers, young, serious, their hands resting near their belts with practiced readiness. Vanessa Gaines Miller. Moreno's voice cut through the room like a blade. Richard Anthony Gaines, Tina Marie Marsh. You are under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering. The color drained from Vanessa's face like water from a cracked vessel. Richard tried to speak, that silver tongue searching for purchase, but Moreno continued reading rights in a flat, relentless monotone. Tina began to cry, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers. And Derek stood frozen by the window, watching his wife's world collapse, his reflection a ghost against the glass. This is insane. Vanessa's voice had risen to a pitch I'd never heard before, shrill, desperate, stripped of its usual careful control. You can't do this. We haven't done anything wrong. Martha, tell them. Theodore stepped forward, placing a single sheet of paper on the table. This is a bearer bond custody receipt, he said, signed by Harold Miller 2 months before his death. Attached to it was a handwritten letter, a confession of what he'd discovered. He read aloud. Harold's words filling the room, each sentence another nail in the coffin Vanessa had built for herself. Vanessa has been stealing from us. Over $2 million. Wire transfers with my forged signature. And Eugene helped her. Eugene? Tina looked up, confused through her tears. What does Eugene have to do with... He provided the signature samples. Moreno pulled out another document. We have his statement. He's already in custody. Richard made one last attempt, that con artist's desperation when the mark finally sees the cards. This is clearly a misunderstanding. The transfers were authorized. I can show you documentation. The documentation you forged? Moreno almost smiled. We've traced every wire, Mr. Gaines, every shell company, every offshore account, which, by the way, have all been frozen as of yesterday morning. That explained Vanessa's panic. The walls closing in, and she hadn't even known it. I stood. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the old woman in the navy dress and pearls, the widow they'd dismissed, the furniture they'd planned to discard. I reached into my purse and withdrew the cream-colored paper, held it up so Vanessa could see her husband's handwriting, the evidence she'd thrown away like trash. You said this should stay buried forever, Vanessa. My voice was steady, carrying 40 years of strength Harold had always seen in me. But the truth has a way of rising, especially when you underestimate the woman who built everything you tried to steal. I set the paper on the table. The only thing buried now is your future. Something broke behind Vanessa's eyes. The polished surface cracked, and beneath it was nothing but rage, raw, feral, uncontained. You bitch! She lunged. The officers moved fast, faster than I would have thought possible, catching her mid-stride, pulling her arms behind her back. She thrashed against them, screaming words that dissolved into incoherent fury. Richard went quietly, that survivor's instinct telling him the game was lost. Tina sobbed as they led her toward the door, blubbering apologies to no one in particular. But Vanessa, even as the officers dragged her from the room, turned her head toward Derek. Tell them it was a mistake! Her voice cracked with desperation. Tell them I didn't mean it! Derek! Tell them! My son stood motionless by the window. His wife's screams echoed off the walls, bounced against the glass, filled the space where their marriage had just died. He said nothing. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. The sun was setting over Cedarbrook when I finally allowed myself to breathe. Theodore's office had become a sanctuary in the hours since the arrests, a quiet harbor while the storm raged elsewhere. Through the window, I watched the sky turn from pale blue to amber to the deep crimson of a wound beginning to heal. The traffic on Main Street had resumed its ordinary rhythms. People walked dogs, children rode bicycles. The world continued spinning, indifferent to the fact that mine had just tilted back onto its proper axis. "It's done." Theodore set a fresh cup of coffee in front of me, hot this time, the steam rising like a gentle ghost. "Eugene was taken into custody an hour ago. They found him at his cabin, trying to pack." "Did he resist?" "No." Theodore settled into the chair across from me. "He asked about you, actually. Wanted to know if you'd ever forgive him." I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic. Forgiveness. Such a small word for such an enormous thing. "I don't know the answer to that yet." Theodore nodded, understanding. "The federal prosecutor will want to meet with you next week. Your testimony will be crucial, but the evidence Harold left behind is solid. The forged signatures, the wire transfers, the shell company, it's all documented." "And the bearer bonds?" "Safe in the vault, $500,000, untouched." He allowed himself a small smile. "Harold always was thorough." Thorough. Yes, that was Harold. The man who counted every nail, balanced every ledger, loved every detail of the life we'd built together. Even at the end, even with his heart failing and his time running short, he'd found a way to protect me. I blinked back the tears that still came so easily. "The company," I said. "Miller Hardware. Can it survive this?" "It'll take work. The embezzled funds are likely unrecoverable. Too many offshore accounts. Too many layers. But the core business is sound. The employees are loyal. The reputation Harold built over 40 years. Theodore leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "That's not something anyone can steal, Martha. That lives in this town's memory, in the people he helped." Through the window, I could see the First Regional Bank sign glowing in the fading light. Beyond it, somewhere in the gathering dusk, was the hardware store where Harold had spent his life, where I had spent mine. It would survive. We would survive. The house was different when I returned. Not the structure. The colonial bones Harold had built still stood solid and sure, the porch light glowing its familiar welcome. But the air inside had changed. The heaviness was gone, replaced by something lighter. Emptier, yes, but clean. Like a room after the windows have been thrown open to let out stale smoke. I walked through the hallways slowly, trailing my fingers along walls that had held 4 decades of memories. The kitchen where I'd packed lunches and baked birthday cakes. The living room where Derek had taken his first steps, tumbling into Harold's waiting arms. The stairs we'd climbed 10,000 times, carrying groceries and laundry and the ordinary weight of ordinary days. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel the absence beside me. The pillow still held its impression. The sheets still carried his scent, fainter now, fading, but present. "I did it," I whispered to the empty room. "I won." But victory tasted strange. Not sweet, not bitter, just heavy, like a meal eaten after too long a fast. Necessary, but overwhelming. I rose and walked to Harold's office. The green wingback chair waited where it had always been. The desk where Vanessa had searched so frantically now sat undisturbed, its drawers closed, its secrets revealed. I lowered myself into my chair, the one Harold had bought so I could keep him company, and let the familiar leather embrace me one last time. The cream-colored letter was still in my purse. I didn't need to read it again. I'd memorized every word, every curve of Harold's handwriting, every ounce of love and faith he'd poured into those final paragraphs. "You're stronger than me. You always were." Outside, gravel crunched in the driveway. Headlights swept across the window, then went dark. I heard a car door close. Footsteps on the porch, the front door opening with its familiar creak. And then my son's voice, small and broken. "Mom?" Derek stood in the office doorway like a man facing a firing squad. His eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from hours of tears. His shoulders, those shoulders that had spent years slumping under Vanessa's control, now sagged with something heavier than submission. Shame. The weight of reckoning. I knew. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. I knew something was wrong. The late nights. The phone calls she didn't want me to hear. The way she looked at Dad's accounts like they were her personal piggy bank. His voice cracked. I told myself it was nothing. Told myself I was imagining things. But I knew, Mom. I knew, and I did nothing. I watched my son crumble. Watched the facade he'd built, the comfortable ignorance, the willful blindness, collapse into rubble at his feet. I was a coward, he continued, tears streaming now. Dad built everything for us, and I let her take it, because it was easier, because I didn't want to fight. He sank to his knees on the Persian rug. The same rug where he'd played with toy trucks as a child. The same rug where Harold had taught him to tie his shoes. How do you live with that, Mom? How do you come back from being the person I've been? I rose from my chair, crossed the room slowly, lowered myself to the floor beside him, my knees protesting, my heart breaking and mending all at once. Your father left me a letter, I said softly. Do you know what it said about you? Derek shook his head, unable to speak. He said not to trust you until you proved yourself. I reached out, cupped his tear-stained cheek in my palm. He didn't say to give up on you, Derek. He said to wait, because he believed you could be more than what you'd become. My son's sob broke free, a raw, animal sound of grief and relief, and the first fragile stirrings of hope. Here's what happens now, I continued. You testify. You tell the prosecutors everything, every document you signed, every conversation you overheard, every suspicion you buried. And then you come to work. He looked up, confused. The hardware store. You start at the bottom, sweeping floors, stocking shelves, learning the business your father built, the way he learned it, with your hands and your sweat and your honesty. I held his gaze. You earn your way back, Derek. One nail at a time. Mom, I don't deserve. No, you don't. But this isn't about deserving. I pulled him into my arms, held him the way I'd held him when he was small, and the world seemed too big and too frightening. This is about choosing who you want to be. Your father believed you could be better. So do I. We stayed there as darkness filled the windows, mother and son, kneeling on an old rug in an empty office, beginning the long work of rebuilding. Later, after Derek had gone to his childhood room to sleep the sleep of the truly exhausted, I returned to the office one final time. I stood at the window, looking out at the stars beginning to emerge over Cedarbrook. We did it, Harold, I said to the night. The truth rose, just like you promised, and I'll protect what we built, every nail, every board, every dream. The stars glittered like scattered pearls. Somewhere, I knew, Harold was listening. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I smiled.